thank you very much. It's great to be back here. I've been in Idaho since 1985, and in 1990, my old newspaper, the Idaho Falls Post-Register, Rogers here, sent me on a 6-month trip to look at how the Endangered Species Act was affecting the Pacific Northwest. And we said at the time that law would have more effect than any other law on the next decade. Well, it turns out it's still having an effect. And I got a chance. At the time, I went all the way down to Oregon and Washington, up and down the Columbia, all over the region, looking at issues about salmon and other things. So this time, my editors sent me on a 6-month trip. How many reporters get that these days, huh? Along with my partner, Ali Rizvi from McClatchy, who's a videographer. And we started at the mouth of the Columbia. Then we essentially went up the Columbia, following Idaho's salmon home, turned right on the Snake River, then went both up the up the Clearwater, and then again up the Salmon River in May. What I found was how much, even though this is an issue I've covered for a long time, it really woke me up, I guess, to look at this issue in a different way. And I'm going to give you a sneak peek of Ali's work. This will begin our series on Sunday and Monday, but it's going to go all summer at different times. We'll keep working on it all the way into October. Ali Rizvi.
It's been said that salmon are among the most tenacious animals on Earth. They leave our rivers in their infancy and disappear into the vast Pacific Ocean. They roam the Pacific for years, collecting nutrients from as far as Japan and Russia, only to come back into our rivers, spreading out across Washington, Oregon, and up into Idaho. Once they spawn in a haunting river dance, they die, giving their bodies to our watersheds, enriching them and nourishing all those inhabiting the area. The salmon have been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. But in 150 years of civilization, they have been pushed to the edge of extinction. Serious obstacles like dams in the Pacific Northwest cut off 1,200 miles of spawning habitat. The dams on the Snake and Columbia rivers have arguably the most sophisticated salmon passage facilities in the world. Still, 8 stand between the spawning grounds and the Pacific, a barrier difficult to overcome. Those dams produce low-carbon electricity that still provides the Pacific Northwest with inexpensive power. Farmers pump water from their reservoirs for crops like grapes, apples, potatoes, watermelon, corn, and grain. Wheat farmers ship their crops on barges that carry it to Portland for export to Asia. But habitat destruction, pollution, and historic overharvest have helped bring wild salmon to the brink of extinction. Critics call for breaching of 4 of the 8 dams on the Snake River in Washington. They say they aren't needed and that they're costly for salmon. The dam's defenders say breaching would make irrigation impossible, shipping for wheat farmers prohibitive, and add to power costs. The advent of solar, wind, and new energy efficiency technology, and the need to reduce carbon emissions, complicates the debate. The dilemma faced by the Pacific Northwest is one we should all be watching. It's one of the most sophisticated dam systems in existence. What is decided here could serve as a benchmark for future generations, as they carefully weigh how to balance the precious environment with the necessary infrastructure. Once, the Columbia River Chinook salmon run was the greatest in the world. But what are we willing to sacrifice to keep them swimming through our lives?
Thank you. You know, that's the kind of thing I got to do standing next to Ali. You know, I'm here though, I want to talk about why our region, I need a little light on this. Can we give me a little light so I can, whatever. Hey, thanks. I'm here to talk about why our region needs, for our salmon to be restored, our region needs to have faith in wildness. Now, for me, wildness is both physical, it's mental, it's spiritual. We think about wildness mostly as places, but wildness is a state of mind. I was clearing my backyard of the year before's tomato plants a couple of years ago when suddenly I start hearing sandhill cranes. And, you know, that was really out of place in my backyard in Boise. But then suddenly, the sound transformed me to the Marsh Creek Meadow of the headwaters of the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. The shrubs of my garden became sagebrush. I could smell it. My cherry trees and apple trees turned into lodgepole pines. Reaching down to the edge of the bubbling creek filled with wild salmon doing their haunting river dance. That dance and those remarkable wild fish were what brought me to Marsh Creek to watch them spawn. In the shallow water where the female had beat her tail to meet in the gravel, to build a red. After a lifetime where she'd hatched in the same creek, reared there for a year, was washed down to sea in the spring runoff, and then swam thousands of miles before returning to Marsh Creek after 8 dams and surviving. And after that dance, after laying her eggs, she died. Then suddenly I kind of wake up and I realize, oh no, I'm in my backyard. And what I realized is I looked up and those sandhill cranes were actually flying over my house. And they formed a V, and some of them were going north and some of them were riding the thermals, and it was a pretty cool thing right over my house in Boise. And what happened was essentially, the sound connected me with a wild past that we all share. It's a memory. It's a shared memory of a time before civilization. It's the sound of the sandhill and the splashing of spawning salmon is a power we lose in a world tied to screens. We will need more nature and more wildness than we have today, and we're going to need wild in places that are not wild today. That's hard for us especially we boomers, who spent, the last 50 years, trying to protect the last wilderness places that we have left. But now we have to look beyond that. We have to really realize we need wilds because they're the place from where we came. Wildness carved the grooves of ancient truth into our souls. Now, for salmon, this is an incredible species. Only 5% of the fish that begin the migration all across the Pacific Northwest, that includes the ones that are, coming out of the streams close to the ocean, only 5% of them return after 1 to 3 years out in the ocean. In Idaho, some of these fish don't make it, there's less than 1%. So, that means these are the exceptional fish, the ones that make it back to Marsh Creek. Meriwether Lewis described salmon numbers as almost inconceivable, and there once was 8 to 16 million that came back to the Columbia Basin. First, we overfished the heck out of them in filled canneries, and by the time the 30s, many of our runs were already gone. And then we've built this whole series of dams, some with no fish passage at all, like Grand Coulee and the Hells Canyon Complex. But their number, finally we started thinking about them. Thanks to the Native American tribes who started fighting for their own right to have the fish they retained that right when they wrote the treaties of years ago. But that fight really kind of got us started again. That's because they had a spiritual connection with the wildness of salmon. So today, as in history, the strength of salmon, really the soul of the Pacific Northwest, reveals the health of its ecosystems. For the last 150 years, people have altered the landscape. It's a land, the Columbia Basin is essentially the size of France. We've been cutting down the forests, replacing them with farms, irrigated with water pumped from the rivers. Mines filled tributaries with heavy metal, and sediment still bleeds into waters and covers the gravel where the salmon lay their eggs. Rivers were channeled and diked off from their floodplains that made them cool and complex, ideal for the rearing fish in their first year of life. And then, of course, hatcheries were built to replace the wild. Managers were careless. They would get those brood stock wherever they could find it. Didn't matter if it came from that ecosystem or not. In 1970, hatchery production exceeded natural salmon production for the first time. By 1980, 75% of the entire run of salmon and steelhead were produced in hatcheries. Today, 80% of all production in the Columbia River comes from hatcheries. That's a pretty amazing number when you think about it, because we've had a lot of great runs, we've thought, over the last decade when the ocean turned in a productive way. But now the ocean's turning the other way. And this year it's been really bad. We have some of the lowest runs we've had since 1995. And some of our runs, like our spring Chinook and our B-run steelhead, are really back to on the extinction direction. And that's not good to see. And that takes me back to Marsh Creek. It's in the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness, of course, one of my favorite places in the world. This is the highest place in the world where salmon spawn. Did you know that? It's 7,000 feet in elevation, and it's more than 800 miles from the Pacific. It takes a pretty hardy fish to do that climb. In 1995, only 22 reds were counted in all of the Middle Fork. 23,000 had been there in the 1950s. 23,000 to 22. There's been about 800 over the last decade. Now, I've been returning to Marsh Creek nearly every year since Roger Plotho sent me there in 1990. Those wild fish have told me and fisheries biologists a story most people in the region still don't want to hear. The only thing holding Marsh Creek salmon back are the natural cycles of the Pacific and the dams on the Columbia and Snake River. Now, as we showed in our video, it is an incredible fish passage system that they've built on those dams. You can't dismiss it. It really has offset so much from where it was in 1990. But as it said, there's still 8 dams. 8's a lot of dams for those fish to go through. The thing about what Marsh Creek tells us, though, is, they never used hatchery fish for Marsh Creek. It has always been wild fish. The habitat is as pristine as it gets. It forces we Idahoans to look at the dams for salvation. Now, we must restore our own faith in wildness. That means not just the dams. We've got to talk about hatcheries too, even though that means harvest and fishing that a lot of people would be very unwilling to give up even for the short period of time. These are very hard things for us to examine. But, you know, but the thing is, the scientists tell us that if we do that, that it works. If we restore the wildness to these salmon, then they've got an amazing productivity. They've got a productivity that looks like that forest full of monarchs. And we can have that again in this region. And so it's going to take some transformation. I was going to talk more about specifics of dam power. We're going to have that in our series. And the bottom line is there are ways that can be worked out, but we in the region have to make those decisions. It's not up to me. It's going to be to all of us in the Pacific Northwest and perhaps in the United States. But I want to leave you with, you know, there's this resiliency in the salmon population that we don't have to like give up everything. We still can live in this wonderful place. We can still have a healthy economy. It's about restoring that resiliency. And Aldo Leopold himself laid out a guide in his book, A Sand County Almanac, that I call the resiliency principle. Quote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise." The resiliency principle was for Leopold the foundation for conservation choices. It should be our primary guide for the future. Thank you.